Bruna adjusted her name tag as she pushed through the swinging door leading to the restaurant floor. The aroma of grilled food and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but the warmth of the smells did little to ease the cold knot in her stomach. It had been another grueling day. Between double shifts at the Pine Grove Diner and calls from the hospital, she was running on nothing but sheer willpower. The clock on the wall read 6:12 p.m. The dinner rush had started early, and Bruna barely had time to catch her breath before another customer flagged her down. With a practiced smile, she approached the table. "Hi there, what can I get started for you?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. The man mumbled his order without looking up, his eyes glued to his phone. Bruna nodded politely and moved to the next table, her movements efficient, almost robotic. Her regulars greeted her with friendly waves, but even their warm smiles couldn't cut through the heavy fog in her mind. Her son, Lucas, was 7 years old and the brightest light in her life. But tonight, that light felt faint. Earlier that day, she had received a call from the hospital. The payment for Lucas's next round of treatments was due by the end of the month, and Bruna was short, painfully short. She had already maxed out her credit cards and borrowed from anyone who might be able to help. The figure they quoted her echoed in her head like a cruel taunt, $15,000. "Bruna, table 4's order is ready," her coworker Tina called from the kitchen. Bruna jolted, realizing she'd been standing still for too long. "Thanks, Tina," she replied, rushing to grab the plates. She plastered on a smile as she delivered the food, apologizing for the slight delay. In moments of quiet, brief as they were, Bruna's thoughts always drifted back to Lucas. She pictured his small face, still smiling despite everything, and his laughter that had the power to brighten even her darkest days. She'd promised him that she'd figure things out, but with each passing day, that promise felt harder to keep. A burst of laughter from a nearby table pulled her back to reality. One of her regulars, an older man named Joe, waved her over. "Bruna, you doing okay?" he asked kindly as she refilled his coffee cup. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just a busy night, Joe. You know how it is." Joe smiled, but his eyes were full of concern. "You're strong, Bruna. Stronger than most people I know." His words made her throat tighten, but she pushed the feeling aside and moved to the next table. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m., the rush had died down. Bruna leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on her apron and trying to focus on the tasks ahead. But her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened, and a man walked in. He was dressed casually, wearing a hoodie, baseball cap, and sunglasses. He looked like any other customer, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made her take notice. Bruna grabbed her notepad and walked toward him. "Hi there. Welcome to the Pine Grove Diner. Can I get you something to drink?" The man looked up briefly, flashing a polite smile. "Just water for now, thanks." She nodded, writing it down. He didn't seem like the chatty type, so she decided to give him space. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him somewhere before. But with so much on her mind, she quickly brushed the thought aside. The doorbell chimed again as Bruna returned to the counter to grab a water pitcher. The diner wasn't particularly crowded tonight, but the man who'd just walked in stood out. He sat quietly in a booth near the window, gazing outside as if he were lost in thought. Bruna's curiosity lingered, but she reminded herself it wasn't her place to pry. Balancing the pitcher in a glass, she made her way back to his table. "Here you go," she said, setting the glass down. "Ready to order, or do you need a few minutes?" The man lowered his sunglasses slightly, his dark eyes glancing at the menu for a moment. "I'll take the special. Whatever it is." Bruna raised an eyebrow, amused. "The special tonight's meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Sound good?" He nodded. "Perfect. Thanks." She jotted down the order, her practiced smile intact, and walked back to the kitchen. The casual way he spoke made her feel at ease, but there was still something familiar about him. She couldn't put her finger on it. At the counter, her coworker Tina leaned over with a smirk. "He's cute, huh?" she teased in a hushed voice. Bruna rolled her eyes. Come on, Tina. He's just another customer. Yeah, sure. You haven't stopped looking over at him since he sat down, Tina quipped, nudging her playfully. Bruna laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm not looking at him. I don't know. He seems familiar. Maybe he's one of those tech guys who got famous on the internet, Tina offered. You know, the ones who wear hoodies and act all mysterious. Bruna chuckled. Maybe. But as she returned to the kitchen to check on the food, the thought nagged at her. She grabbed the plate once it was ready and carried it out to his table. Here you go. Enjoy, she said, placing the meal in front of him. He glanced up at her briefly. Thanks. Bruna noticed the way he said it, genuine, not just polite. It was rare for someone to look her in the eye like that. For a brief moment, she wondered what his story was, but before she could dwell on it, another customer called for her attention. The night wore on, and the stranger remained quietly in his booth, eating slowly and occasionally glancing out the window. Bruna noticed he didn't seem to be in any hurry. Unlike the other customers, who usually rushed through their meals, he appeared to be savoring the moment. As Bruna cleared a nearby table, she overheard him speaking softly into his phone. His voice was low, but the accent caught her attention. A subtle Portuguese lilt. Her curiosity spiked again, and her mind began to piece things together. Could he be? No, she told herself. It was ridiculous. What would someone like him be doing in a diner like this, all alone? Still, she couldn't shake the thought. Bruna, Tina whispered, startling her. Are you okay? You've been staring at that guy like he's a unicorn. I wasn't staring, Bruna shot back, her face flushing. I thought I recognized him. Maybe he's some big shot, Tina teased. You should ask for his autograph. Bruna laughed nervously. Yeah, right. Like I'd do that. But as the man finished his meal and pushed his plate aside, Bruna knew she had to stop overthinking. She grabbed her notepad and headed to his table to clear the dishes. Everything okay? She asked, smiling. Yeah, he replied. Food was great. Thanks. There it was again, that brief but kind look that seemed to pierce right through her. She nodded and reached for the plate, but before she could pick it up, he spoke again. You're working pretty hard tonight, he said. Tough day? Bruna hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She wasn't used to customers asking about her. Something like that, she replied, trying to keep her tone light. But that's life, right? He smiled faintly. Yeah. I get it. And just like that, the moment passed. Bruna took the plate and walked away, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. By the time the clock struck 9:30 p.m., the stranger was still there, sipping a cup of coffee he'd ordered after his meal. Bruna was wiping down the counter when she caught Tina staring at her with a knowing look. What? Bruna asked. Nothing, Tina said, smirking. Just waiting to see if your mystery man's gonna leave you a love letter or something. Bruna laughed, but her nerves buzzed. As she glanced back at his booth, she noticed him pulling out his wallet. He tucked something under the bill, stood up, and adjusted his hoodie. Thanks for the meal, he said, his voice calm but sincere. Bruna nodded. Have a good night. And with that, he walked out, the doorbell chiming softly behind him. Bruna exhaled, relieved and a little disappointed at the same time. When she returned to the table to collect the check, she froze. Beneath the receipt was a crisp $100 bill. And beneath that, a folded note. Her heart began to race as she reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. Unfolding the note, she read the words scrawled in neat handwriting. Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think. Bruna stared at the note, her breath catching in her throat. Who was this man, and how did he know exactly what she needed to hear? Bruna sat in the back of the diner, staring at the note clutched in her hand. The crisp $100 bill sat on the table in front of her, an unusual tip for a meal that cost less than $20. But it wasn't the money that left her feeling shaken, it was the words. Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think. How could a complete stranger have such a profound impact in just a few words? Did he overhear her conversation with Tina? Or was it simply a coincidence? Either way, his message lingered in her mind, like a tiny spark of hope she hadn't felt in months. Bruna. Tina's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to reality. What are you doing back here? We still have tables to clear. Bruna quickly folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket. Sorry, I'll be right there. The night wore on, and Bruna did her best to focus on her work. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious man. His voice, his calm demeanor, his faint accent, it all seemed too familiar. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. As she wiped down the last of the tables, Joe, her regular customer, waved her over. Bruna, you look like you've seen a ghost, he said with a chuckle. What's on your mind? She hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. Nothing much. Just a long day. Joe tilted his head, unconvinced. You know, it's okay to admit when something's bothering you. You don't have to carry everything on your own. Bruna smiled faintly. Thanks, Joe. I'll keep that in mind. His words stayed with her as she finished her shift. Maybe he was right, maybe she didn't have to handle everything alone. But it wasn't like she had many options. The reality of her situation was simple: if she didn't find a way to pay Lucas's medical bills, no one else would. By the time Bruna got home that night, the diner was the last thing on her mind. She quietly tiptoed into Lucas's room, careful not to wake him. The small glow of his nightlight illuminated his face, peaceful and untroubled. Bruna knelt beside his bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Hey, buddy, she whispered. I promise I'm going to figure this out. I don't know how yet, but I will. Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her eyes, not wanting to let her emotions get the better of her. She kissed his forehead and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. The next morning, Bruna arrived at the diner early for another shift. She'd barely stepped inside when Tina rushed up to her, excitement written all over her face. Bruna! You are not going to believe this, Tina said, practically bouncing on her heels. What is it? Bruna asked, setting her bag down. Tina handed her a newspaper, pointing to a photo on the front page. It was the man from last night, dressed in a sharp suit, standing in front of a crowd of reporters. It's him, Tina said, grinning. The guy from last night. That's Neymar. Bruna's heart dropped. She stared at the photo, her mind racing. Neymar. Of course. She'd heard the name before, who hadn't? But seeing him in the paper, knowing he'd been sitting in her diner, was almost too much to process. You mean the soccer player? Bruna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah. He's one of the biggest stars in the world, Tina said. How did you not recognize him? I mean, he was wearing sunglasses, but still. Bruna didn't answer. Her thoughts were spinning too fast. If it really was Neymar, then the note and the tip suddenly made a lot more sense. But why would someone like him care about her? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Customers came and went, orders were taken and served, but Bruna couldn't stop thinking about Neymar. She replayed their brief interaction in her mind, trying to make sense of it. What had he seen in her that made him leave such a generous tip? By the time her shift ended, she still didn't have any answers. But one thing was clear, she couldn't let this moment go to waste. Neymar's words had struck a chord in her, and she wasn't about to ignore it. Bruna pulled the note out of her pocket and read it again. Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she really was stronger than she thought. Bruna's heart raced as she stepped outside the diner at the end of her shift. The note and the generous tip had become her focus, pushing aside her exhaustion and worry. She clutched the small piece of paper in her pocket like it was a lifeline, its words repeating in her mind. Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think. As she walked to her car, the weight of her struggles felt lighter for the first time in months. There was something about the encounter with Neymar, whether it was fate, luck, or sheer coincidence, that made her believe things could finally change. The next morning, Bruna woke up early, determined to make progress on Lucas's medical bills. She'd been making calls for weeks, trying to negotiate payments or seek financial assistance, but her efforts had led nowhere. Still, Neymar's note had given her a renewed sense of purpose. With a cup of coffee in hand, she opened her laptop and began researching local charities and organizations that might be able to help. Hours passed, and frustration crept in as every option seemed to hit a dead end. Bruna leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up to see a text from Tina. "Tina, Bruna, check this out." Attached was a link to an article about Neymar. The headline read, "Neymar Jr. spotted dining at local New Jersey diner during charity event weekend." Bruna clicked the link, her hands trembling slightly. The article detailed how Neymar had been in town for a youth soccer charity event and had visited several local spots, including her diner. Her heart swelled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. He wasn't just a soccer star, he was someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. That afternoon, Bruna headed back to the diner for her shift, the article still fresh in her mind. The moment she walked through the door, Tina rushed over to her. "Did you see it? You're basically famous now," Tina joked, holding up her phone with the article on display. Bruna laughed nervously. "I don't think anyone cares about the waitress in the story." "Well, I do," Tina said, her tone softening. "You deserve something good to happen to you, Bruna. And who knows? Maybe this is just the beginning." Bruna nodded, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't know what the future held, but she was starting to believe it might not be as bleak as she'd thought. Later that evening, Bruna found herself staring at the booth where Neymar had sat. She replayed their brief interaction in her mind, the quiet way he had observed the room, the genuine tone of his voice, and the unexpected kindness he'd shown her. As she cleared a nearby table, Joe, her regular customer, called out to her. "Bruna, got a minute?" She walked over, smiling. "What's up, Joe?" He held out a folded piece of paper. "Saw this on the bulletin board at the community center. Thought you might be interested." Bruna unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the text. It was a flyer for a local charity that helped families struggling with medical expenses. They were hosting an event the following week and were accepting applications for assistance. Her breath caught. Could this be the answer she'd been looking for? "Thank you, Joe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This means a lot." Joe nodded, his expression warm. "You've got a good heart, Bruna. I know things will work out for you." The week passed in a blur as Bruna prepared her application for the charity event. She gathered medical records, financial statements, and a heartfelt letter explaining her situation. By the time the day of the event arrived, she was a bundle of nerves. When she walked into the community center, she was greeted by friendly volunteers who guided her through the application process. Bruna sat down in a crowded room, clutching her papers tightly. She couldn't help but notice the banners on the walls, many of which bore Neymar's name. It was clear he had been a significant donor to the organization. As the event went on, Bruna found herself talking to other families who were facing similar struggles. Hearing their stories reminded her that she wasn't alone. Finally, it was her turn to meet with a representative. Bruna took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined to share her story with honesty and hope. Later that evening, Bruna returned home, emotionally drained but hopeful. The representative had assured her that her application would be reviewed carefully and that she would hear back within a few weeks. As she tucked Lucas into bed that night, Bruna felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "Mom?" Lucas asked sleepily, his small hand reaching for hers. Yeah, buddy? Are we gonna be okay? Bruna's throat tightened, but she forced herself to smile. We're going to be more than okay. I promise. Lucas nodded, his eyes drifting closed. Bruna stayed by his side, silently thanking Neymar for the spark of hope he'd given her. The days after the charity event were filled with cautious optimism. Bruna had put everything she had into the application, and though she tried not to get her hopes up too high, a part of her believed something good would come of it. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a life where Lucas was healthy and she didn't have to worry about losing their home. One afternoon, as she prepared for her shift at the diner, her phone buzzed on the counter. She grabbed it quickly, her heart leaping when she saw the caller ID, the charity. Hello? Bruna answered, her voice tight with anticipation. Hi, Bruna. This is Karen from the Community Hope Foundation, the woman on the other end said warmly. I'm calling about your application. Bruna held her breath, clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. I'm happy to let you know that we've approved your request for assistance, Karen continued. We'll be covering Lucas's upcoming medical treatments in full. Bruna's knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself against the kitchen counter, tears streaming down her face. Oh my God. Thank you. I don't even know what to say. No thanks are necessary, Karen said kindly. You've been through so much, and we're here to help. We'll send you all the details by email, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Bruna ended the call, her hands shaking as she set the phone down. Relief and gratitude washed over her in waves. For months, she had felt like she was drowning, barely able to keep her head above water. Now, for the first time, she could breathe. That evening, Bruna shared the news with Lucas. Sitting on the couch with him, she explained that his treatments were going to continue and that she didn't want him to worry anymore. So we're really going to be okay? Lucas asked, his wide eyes filled with cautious hope. Bruna pulled him into a hug, her tears soaking into his hair. Yes, baby. We're going to be okay. For the first time in a long time, Lucas's laughter filled the room, a sound Bruna had missed more than she realized. That night, as Lucas slept peacefully in his room, Bruna sat at the kitchen table and pulled Neymar's note from her pocket. She read it again and again, the words resonating deeply. Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think. In the days that followed, Bruna began to think about how she could give back. Neymar's generosity and the charity's support had changed her life, and she wanted to pay that kindness forward. The idea came to her while she was at the diner, watching a young mother struggle with her toddler as she counted out change to pay for their meal. After work that night, Bruna sat down with a notebook and began brainstorming. She envisioned a support group for families like hers, parents facing financial and emotional hardships, unsure where to turn. She decided to call it Lucas Hope in honor of her son, whose resilience inspired her every day. Starting Lucas Hope wasn't easy. Bruna spent her evenings researching, reaching out to local businesses for support, and connecting with other families in the community. Word spread quickly, and within weeks, she had a small but passionate group of volunteers helping her organize fundraisers and events. One of their first initiatives was a free meal program for struggling families. Bruna partnered with local diners, including the Pine Grove Diner, to provide meals for those in need. Seeing the smiles on people's faces as they shared a warm meal reminded her why she had started this journey. Months later, Lucas Hope had grown beyond anything Bruna had imagined. The organization was featured in a local newspaper, and donations began pouring in. Families who had once felt forgotten now had a place to turn, and Bruna found a renewed sense of purpose in helping others. One evening, as Bruna was finishing a meeting with her volunteers, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it and froze when she saw the sender's name, Neymar. The message was short but heartfelt. Bruna, I heard about everything you're doing with Lucas Hope. I'm proud of you. Your strength is inspiring, and I'd like to help in any way I can. Let me know how I can support your work. Best, Neymar. Bruna's hands trembled as she read the email. Tears filled her eyes as she realized how far she had come since that fateful night at the diner. Neymar's simple gesture had set off a chain of events that changed not only her life but the lives of countless others. That night, as Bruna sat on her porch watching Lucas play in the yard, she felt a deep sense of peace. Life still had its challenges, but she knew she could face anything that came her way. Neymar's words had been right all along. She was stronger than she thought. The warm glow of the evening sun filtered through the window as Bruna sat at her kitchen table, Lucas's laughter drifting in from the backyard. The past months had been a whirlwind of challenges and triumphs, but tonight, Bruna felt a rare sense of calm. She opened her laptop, Neymar's email still fresh in her mind. His words echoed with the same encouragement as the note he'd left in the diner. But now, they carried even more weight. Neymar wasn't just someone who had given her a generous tip, he was a catalyst for a profound change in her life. And through his gesture, she had discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. Bruna clicked reply and began to type. Subject: thank you. Dear Neymar, I hope this email finds you well. I want to start by saying thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for everything you've done. The night you walked into the Pine Grove Diner, I had no idea how much my life was about to change. At the time, I was barely holding on. My son Lucas's medical bills were piling up, and I felt like I was drowning. Then you came along, not just as a customer, but as someone who saw me, someone who gave me hope when I needed it most. Your words, "Never stop fighting. You're stronger than you think," became my mantra. They carried me through some of my darkest moments, and they inspired me to create something meaningful, Lucas Hope. I started this organization to help families like mine, families who feel overwhelmed, forgotten, and lost. What began as a small community group has grown into something much bigger, and your generosity played a huge role in making it possible. Thank you for believing in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself. And thank you for reminding me that even small acts of kindness can spark incredible change. If you ever want to visit Lucas Hope or see the impact you've had firsthand, I would be honored to show you. With gratitude, Bruna. Bruna read over the email twice before hitting send. As she watched the message sent confirmation pop up on the screen, a sense of closure and fulfillment washed over her. She didn't know if Neymar would reply or if he'd visit, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd taken the time to express her gratitude and share how his kindness had rippled outward. A few weeks later, Bruna stood in front of a crowd at the first annual fundraiser for Lucas Hope. The community center was packed with families, volunteers, and donors, all gathered to support the cause. Bruna stepped up to the microphone, her hands steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Good evening, everyone, she began, her voice clear and warm. Thank you for being here tonight and for believing in the mission of Lucas Hope. When I started this journey, I had no idea how far it would go. All I knew was that I wanted to help others the way someone once helped me. She paused, scanning the room. In the back corner, her eyes landed on someone familiar. Her breath caught. It was Neymar. He stood casually, dressed in a simple black sweater, his signature humility evident as he blended into the crowd. Bruna blinked, almost unable to believe it, but his small nod and faint smile confirmed that it was real. Encouraged by his presence, she continued. Sometimes, it takes just one moment, one act of kindness, to change a life. That's what happened to me. Someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and it gave me the strength to keep going. Tonight, I want to share that same hope with all of you. Together, we can make a difference. The room erupted in applause, and Bruna stepped away from the microphone, her heart full. After the event, Neymar approached her quietly, avoiding the crowd. Bruna's face lit up with a mix of surprise and gratitude as he extended a hand. Bruna, he said, his voice calm and sincere. I'm proud of you. She shook his hand, then pulled him into a hug, overwhelmed with emotion. I don't even know how to thank you, she said, her voice trembling. You already have, Neymar replied with a smile. What you've built here, it's incredible. And it's all because of your strength. They talked for a while, Neymar asking questions about Lucas' hope and sharing his admiration for what Bruna had accomplished. Before he left, he made a promise to support the organization, ensuring it could grow and help even more families in need. That night, as Bruna tucked Lucas into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Was that really him, Mom? The soccer guy?" Lucas asked. Bruna smiled and nodded. "Yeah, buddy. That was him." Lucas grinned. "He's cool." "He is," Bruna agreed, her heart swelling with gratitude. "But you know what? You're my real hero." Lucas giggled, and Bruna kissed his forehead before turning off the light. As she closed his door, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. In the months that followed, Lucas' hope continued to thrive, with Neymar's support helping to expand its reach. Bruna often reflected on how far she had come, from a struggling waitress to a community leader. And though life still had its challenges, she faced them with a newfound confidence, knowing she was never truly alone. The note Neymar had left her remained tucked in her wallet, a constant reminder of the power of kindness and the strength she had discovered within herself.